It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the Flight Deck, and as always, some smart talk radio is in your future, and this segment certainly no exception. We say that many times, but I certainly believe that's going to be a fun one. We're going to be talking with Florence Williams, who is a journalist and contributing editor to Outside Magazine. Her work you have seen in the New York Times, the New York Times Magazine, as well as National Geographic, amongst others. A brand new work called The Nature Fix, Why Nature Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Creative. It should be a good conversation indeed. Excited to have her here. Florence, how are you, my friend?
I'm so great. Thanks for having me on today.
Well, you have written books in the past. You do a lot of periodical writing. Why nature? Why? It seems obvious maybe, but why nature? Why a fixation for Florence Williams?
I think it's a good time to be looking at nature in our lives because we are more disconnected from nature than ever before. And yet I feel like it's something we haven't really remarked upon. As far as my personal story, I recently moved from the Rocky Mountains to the heart of Washington, D.C., and I felt this very dramatic loss of nature. So it was something I was thinking about. And as I did more research, I realized that my personal migration is really reflected around the world as more and more people move to urban areas. More people globally live in urban areas now than outside of them. And at the same time, we're experiencing this mass migration inside.
What, when you first, again, you talked a little bit about when you were growing up, you had the opportunity, I think, or maybe I read that in a biography somewhere, you had the opportunity to spend some time in Canada and out west. That probably took to you pretty well, I would think.
Yeah, I was really lucky, although I grew up in New York City. But a couple things. One is I grew up a few blocks from Central Park, which was, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. And he was such a genius at really constructing kind of this, this idea of nature that sort of, conversed well, like with the human mind. He understood that people need nature in order to feel good and sort of release the stresses of urban living. And then at the same time, my dad used to love canoeing. And so every summer we would load up a van with 2 canoes on it. And as you said, drive to Canada, drive out west. And so I had this kind of great wilderness side of my life also.
There's an interesting quote in the book from John Muir that says between every 2 pine trees is a door leading to a new life or a new way of life. That's an interesting one. Share a little bit your thoughts about that one.
Sure. I just love that quote, too. I think John Muir, he was a 19th century kind of hiker philosopher, a great public parks proponent. He really understood that when we spend time in nature, we can really change our lives in a way because it allows us the space and the time to sort of think about our place in the world, think about who we are, who we want to be, allow us to dream big, and not incidentally, really help us recover from grief or from trauma or from stress. He understood that nature was important for healing. And now, as I learned in my book, the science is really bearing him out.
Nature and our relationship with it, especially in Western culture, it's always been a fixation, or it has been throughout the history of the United States, whether it's Thoreau or so many other ones. I'm curious as to what is your particular definition of nature, and let me frame it a little bit. I know what it would mean to somebody that lives self-sustaining in the woods in Vermont. I wonder what it means to somebody that lives at 34th or 78th and Central Park West in New York City. And I'm just curious as to what can nature be a large fruit garden or a vegetable garden in an apartment, or do we need to be far, far away?
That is such a great question. I think philosophers and poets have been asking that question for a long time, too. What counts as nature? But according to the scientists who are researching the beneficial effects of nature on our nervous system, it does not have to be a spectacular, wooded wilderness area or park. Even looking at a potted plant in your house or looking at a tree outside your window, even those micro exposures to nature can actually boost our moods, increase our creativity, and give us a little break that helps us relax a little bit. But having said that, certainly the more nature exposure, the better. But even if you have to start with a potted plant, it's a good place to start.
Yeah. What about, as you research this, I'm curious as to, are other contemporary writers, such as yourself, or maybe from a different industry, even from botany or who knows where, are they discovering, so to speak, the same thing? I mean, it seems logical if you were out in the middle of the woods or in a meadow somewhere, that there was a certain freeing, liberating sense to that. But scientifically, it seems like you're going a little bit deeper here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say that nature exists on sort of a dose curve. So, in a wilderness area, you're going to experience different benefits that, as I say, I think maybe have more to do with kind of deep healing or, deep self-concept of who you want to be in the world. But even just going to a city park for 15 minutes, we know that can reduce blood pressure. It can reduce our heart rate. It can reduce our stress hormones like cortisol. And it can increase our mood and our feelings of connection to one another. Even just, it's amazing to me, 15 or 20 minutes. I spent some time in Finland, and public health researchers there say that they think it's possible to really prevent depression, which is quite common in Finland, by spending a little over an hour a week in the woods.
What about, I'm curious about the loved ones that you have in your family. How much time do they spend there? And I'll ask you directly, do you make it a point, especially now that you've made this move, to get out? And if you do, about how much time a week, a month, whatever, do you spend specifically with nature?
Yeah, absolutely. And now that I've learned how important it is to spend time in nature, and I've learned about the science, I have approached my daily life a little bit differently. I do try to walk. I have a dog, and I'm fortunate that even in Washington, D.C., I live near a couple of parks. So I do try to walk in them about at least 30 minutes a day. So it's not that much time. And I also have a different kind of way I interact with that time. So I don't listen to my headphones. I try not to look at my phone. I really want to maximize kind of the restorative qualities of that 30 minutes, because I know it will just make me feel better later in the day. Plus, I'll also, maybe even solve some problems that I'm working on, with my writing or in my personal life. If I can let myself kind of like zone out and also just enjoy the environment. So pay attention to the birds, pay attention to, what the trees look like, or, what state the season is in. If I make a little bit of an effort to look around me more, I know that I get a greater boost in relaxation.
Again, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. We're talking to author Florence Williams. She's also a journalist and contributing editor to Outside Magazine. You've seen her work in the New York Times, as well as the New York Times Magazine, National Geographic. She also, her first book, Breasts and the Natural and Unnatural History, was a New York Times notable book of 2012. She's also the winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in Science and Technology. She used to live in Boulder, Colorado, and now finds herself, for better or worse, in Washington, D.C., especially these days. Florence, I'm curious as to, again, let's jump back to a city dweller or someone that spends most of their time surrounded by cement at some level. They say, well, that's all well and good, but by the time I get a chance to turn around, it's suddenly Sunday night and I've got to head back to work on Monday morning. How can people commit themselves more and, so to speak, get back to nature, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think sometimes we tend to put it kind of low on the to-do list. We all live incredibly busy lives. We have, demanding jobs, families, errands to be run. But one of the things I've really learned in this book is that if we make an effort to spend a little more time outside, it really pays off. So it pays off in our kind of ability to get along better with our families. We just can get in a better mood, a better headspace. It can help us deal with the stresses of urban living, and even make us more productive when we do go back to work. In fact, there are studies showing that kids who spend time outside do better on tests. They have better attention. Even kids with ADHD, they can improve their symptoms by spending just 20 minutes outside. So it's sort of not just about yet another thing to do on our to-do list, but it's actually something that will improve our productivity and our mental health for the whole rest of the day if we can do it.
You have traveled fairly extensively. I'm curious as to what the places where you have visited, what has been their take. I'm sure you've dealt with people that feel the same way you do, but in general, do you find people that reside in the United States are a little bit more in tune to that, or are we behind our fellow brothers and sisters around the planet?
That's a good question. I would say, in general, the sort of Western cultures, the Judeo-Christian tradition is such that we are separate from nature. And when I spent time in Asia, I really learned that nature is really more fully kind of integrated into daily life in parts of Asia. There are plants that are very meticulously cared for and brought into the home. The approach to even cut flowers. It's kind of a different kind of nature than we have here. In North America, it's more kind of rough and tumble nature, it's more wilderness. In Asia, it's a little more cultivated, and yet I think it's more integrated into daily life. And so what I learned from the Asians is that, if we can really attune all of our senses to the natural world, it's a great way to get that hit of relaxation much more efficiently than if, say we walk into our neighborhoods or our parks with our cell phones and our earbuds and, if we kind of bring our work with us.
Do you think there's a difference in appreciation of and maybe a reaction to nature and all things natural between men and women? Do they appreciate it at different levels?
I didn't really get into the gender specifics so much in the way you're asking, but I did learn some interesting things about gender. One is that in conventional playgrounds, in elementary schools, kind of urban playgrounds, boys get more exercise. They run around more. And in fact, if you look at obesity levels and diabetes levels in urban kids, girls tend to be more at risk for those diseases. But as soon as you let kids run around outside, for example, many parts of Europe, forest kindergarten is a really big thing. Like 10% of kids actually go to kindergarten that are outside all day long. And in those environments, the girls get the same amount of exercise, which I thought was really interesting. So there's this sort of gender leveling effect of being outside in nature in a way that makes everybody healthier.
I'm curious as to what you learned. I mean, I know this is a labor of love for you, but what changed with Florence Williams, the author and the researcher, after writing this book? How are you a different person, or how do you look at things differently now?
I would say I am more mindful of the time I spend outside. I never used to be particularly interested in birds, for example, and now I notice that if I try to pay attention to the birds, I really enjoy my time outside more. And so I'm learning to do that. I'm, learning a little bit of bird song here in Washington, D.C. We're under the Eastern Flyway. We have a lot of amazing birds. I also feel that I'm more passionate than ever about the need to protect and conserve our incredible public lands and our incredible national parks, because they're this amazing legacy that we have for all people. And they were really, protected under these ideas of democracy that I think are so important now. And so I find myself even, more interested in conservation, and also very passionate about the idea of getting kids outside before they lose that innate love of nature that they all are born with.
And again, you bring up kids. Do kids automatically, do they have they developed filters or not developed filters that makes them appreciate nature more or less than adult counterparts?
I think that kids, from what I've learned, are really hardwired to love nature. They're born with an innate love of nature. They're born with an innate need to explore through all of their senses. That's really how the human brain develops. From a very early age, kids just love to touch everything. They love to feel everything and smell everything. And that's how their brains are supposed to learn. And yet we kind of cut this idea off by putting them in preschools and kindergartens that have 4 walls, a desk, a chair, a pencil, and we say it's time to start learning your reading and writing. Sometimes at age 5. And what we're seeing in these kids is that they do exhibit more symptoms of attention deficit disorder. They're bored. They get tired of school by 3rd or 4th grade. They're not getting the time they need to really run outside and be kids. So, yeah, I think we are at risk of cutting off an entire generation of children from their connection to nature.
What about, let's take it down to a local level. You look at city, county governments. What are they doing? Grade them just in general across the country. How good are they at preserving nature as it exists in a particular community versus allowing nature to be swept aside either by development or other reasons?
I think a lot of cities and municipalities and counties and so on are really struggling with this kind of push-pull of developing more open space and also understanding that public parks are necessary. Certainly in cities, especially on the coast, I think there's a growing recognition, that wonderful green space, wonderful bike trails, hiking trails, these things actually draw in young people, young talent, make people want to move to your cities, and it's good for economic growth. And yet, at the same time, I think sometimes, we allow too much development or, we're sort of paving over, cutting down the last of the trees. It's a push-pull that has actually existed in American culture from the very beginning.
Well, it is a fascinating subject. It has been with us longer than we've been around. The work is called The Nature Fix, Why Nature Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Creative. A case well presented by Florence Williams, our guest. Again, a well-known author and columnist. You can see her work in Outside Magazine, amongst others, New York Times, and several other publications. Florence, how can people get a copy of the book and also find out a little bit more about the work that you do?
Oh, thanks so much for asking. I'm sure their local bookstores should have it. They can buy it online, and they can also link directly to places to purchase the book through my website, which is florencewilliams.com.
And Florence, what about any upcoming projects? I know you're kind of doing the book tour thing with this particular The Nature Fix, but what about upcoming projects for you?
Oh, yeah, thanks so much. I do write quite a bit for Outside Magazine. I will be doing more stories for them about the outside and the outdoors and nature and wilderness and human health. I will also be working on a podcast for Outside about some of these topics and specifically around also women and how women are excelling in outdoor and adventure sports. So look for that.
So if you're out in the woods, if you're out by a stream, if you're out in a meadow and you see a woman walking around taking copious notes, it may very well be our friend Florence Williams doing some follow-up work. Again, thank you so much for spending time with us. Appreciate the insights and would love to have you on again after your next project.
Thanks so much, and I hope everyone gets out for a hike today.
Indeed. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large. You love your dog and you love your yard, but sometimes what your dog leaves behind can make you not love your yard so much. Well, when that happens, it's Call of Duty Pet Waste Removal Service to the rescue. Large or small dogs, big yard or small, call Call of Duty. They clean up the mess your dog leaves behind. So if you're tired of cleaning pet waste from your yard, call Call of Duty, 764-7224. That's 764-7224. Prompt, effective, courteous services on the way. Your yard is left clean and waste-free. So don't waste any more time on waste. Call Call of Duty in Lawrence, 764-7224. That's 764-7224. Or visit their website, callofduty2010.com.